Imagine being the most precious child in England, so valuable that your father executed your stepmother just to protect your inheritance, so pampered that dozens of servants existed solely to cater to your every whim, and then dying at 15 in such agony that witnesses couldn't bear to watch. This is the true story of Edward VI, Henry VIII's long-awaited son and heir, whose death was so horrific and unexpected that it shattered the Tudor dynasty and plunged England into chaos. What killed the boy king wasn't battle, plague, or accident. It was a combination of medical ignorance, political manipulation, and the very privilege that was supposed to protect him. Edward's death reveals how even unlimited power and wealth couldn't save a child from becoming a victim of the brutal realities of Tudor medicine and court intrigue. Before we uncover the shocking truth about how England's boy king met his end, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Edward VI's death was covered up for so long that most people still don't know what really killed Henry VIII's precious heir. Edward VI entered the world on October 12, 1537, as the most anticipated baby in English history, the son who finally gave Henry VIII the male heir he had been desperately seeking for nearly 3 decades. His birth cost his mother, Jane Seymour, her life, but Edward's arrival was celebrated throughout England as proof that God had finally blessed the Tudor dynasty with the continuity it needed to survive beyond Henry's death. From his first breath, Edward lived a life of unimaginable privilege and protection that isolated him almost completely from the real world. He was raised in a series of magnificent palaces, surrounded by tutors, servants, and courtiers, whose entire existence revolved around his education, entertainment, and safety. The boy prince never experienced ordinary childhood activities. He couldn't play freely with other children, explore unsupervised, or even eat a meal without multiple servants testing it for poison. Edward's education was designed to create the perfect Renaissance king, combining classical learning with Protestant theology and practical statecraft. His tutors included some of the most brilliant minds in Europe, and by age 10 he could speak fluent Latin, Greek, and French, write sophisticated theological arguments, and discuss complex political theory with adult scholars. However, this intellectual sophistication came at the cost of emotional and social development. Edward had little understanding of normal human relationships or the practical realities faced by his subjects. The young king's daily routine was rigidly structured around ceremonial duties, educational requirements, and carefully controlled social interactions. He woke each morning to the attendance of dozens of servants who dressed him in elaborate clothes worth more than most English families would see in their lifetimes. His meals were elaborate affairs with multiple courses and constant ceremony, even when he ate alone. Every aspect of his life was governed by protocol that emphasized his divine status and separation from ordinary humanity. Henry VIII's death in January 1547 transformed 9-year-old Edward from pampered prince into King of England. But the transition only intensified his isolation from reality. The Privy Council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, became his guardians and regents, making all real decisions while maintaining the fiction that the child king ruled in his own right. Edward attended council meetings, signed documents, and performed ceremonial functions, but he had no real understanding of the political forces that surrounded him. The boy king's personality reflected the contradictions of his upbringing. He was intellectually brilliant but emotionally immature, deeply religious but capable of casual cruelty, politically sophisticated but completely naive about human nature. Contemporary accounts describe him as charming and precocious in formal settings, but prone to frightening outbursts of rage when his will was crossed. His education had taught him that he was divinely appointed to rule over others, but it had never prepared him for the reality that even kings are mortal. Edward's health had always been a source of concern for those around him, though the specific nature of his vulnerabilities was carefully hidden from public view. The boy king was pale, thin, and frequently ill with various ailments that his physicians attributed to the natural delicacy of royal blood and the demands of his intensive education. By early 1553, those closest to King Edward VI began noticing disturbing changes in the 15-year-old monarch that suggested something was seriously wrong with his health, though the true extent of his illness was carefully concealed from the English people, who still saw their boy king as the symbol of England's bright future under Protestant rule. Edward's physical appearance had become increasingly concerning to his courtiers and physicians. The once bright and energetic young king had grown pale and gaunt, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that no amount of cosmetics could completely disguise during public appearances. He had developed a persistent cough that racked his thin frame and left him exhausted after even brief ceremonial duties. His appetite, once healthy for a growing teenager, had diminished dramatically, and he struggled to maintain the weight and energy needed for his royal responsibilities. The king's mood and behavior had also undergone troubling changes that alarmed those who knew him best. Edward, who had always been intellectually sharp and emotionally controlled in public, began experiencing periods of confusion and irritability that were completely out of character. He would fly into sudden rages over minor issues, then collapse into exhaustion that left him unable to participate in government business for hours or even days. Dr. George Owen, the royal physician, found himself in an impossible position as he tried to treat a patient whose illness he couldn't fully understand or publicly acknowledge. The symptoms Edward was displaying, persistent cough, weight loss, fever, and fatigue, suggested consumption, tuberculosis. But admitting that the king had a potentially fatal disease could trigger political chaos and foreign invasion. Dr. Owen began a series of treatments that reflected the medical knowledge of the time but were largely ineffective against what was likely a serious respiratory infection. The political implications of Edward's declining health created a secondary crisis that ran parallel to his medical emergency. The king had no children and no surviving legitimate siblings, making the question of succession a matter of urgent national importance. His half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, had both been declared illegitimate by their fathers' marriages, leaving the crown's inheritance in legal and political uncertainty that could plunge England into civil war if Edward died without resolving the succession. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had gained control of the government after overthrowing Edward Seymour, began implementing increasingly desperate measures to maintain his power in the face of the king's obvious decline. Dudley understood that Edward's death would likely bring Mary Tudor to the throne, and her Catholic faith would mean the end of both the Protestant Reformation and Dudley's own political survival. The Duke's solution was to manipulate the dying Edward into changing the succession, bypassing his half-sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's daughter-in-law, and a Protestant who could be controlled by his family. This required convincing a sick teenager to overturn his father's will and the established laws of inheritance, a manipulation that would have profound consequences for Edward's final weeks. As spring turned to summer in 1553, it became increasingly difficult to hide Edward's deteriorating condition from the court and the public, setting the stage for a medical and political crisis that would define the final chapter of the boy king's short life. By June 1553, King Edward VI's condition had deteriorated so dramatically that even the most optimistic observers could no longer deny that England's boy king was dying. Though the exact nature of his illness remained a closely guarded secret that created opportunities for political manipulation and medical experimentation that would make his final weeks a living nightmare. Dr. George Owen's medical treatments had proven completely ineffective against Edward's advancing illness, leading him to consult with other physicians and even seek advice from foreign medical experts who might have different approaches to the king's mysterious condition. The treatments prescribed reflected the primitive state of 16th century medicine and often caused additional suffering rather than providing relief from Edward's primary symptoms. Bloodletting became a regular torture for the dying king. as physicians drained pints of blood from his already weakened body in the belief that this would balance his humors and restore his health. Edward, already pale and thin, became even more gaunt and weak as his physicians systematically depleted the blood supply his failing organs desperately needed. The bloodletting sessions left him barely conscious and unable to perform even basic royal duties. Purging treatments designed to evacuate Edward's bowels and stomach added digestive agony to his respiratory distress. Powerful laxatives and emetics were administered multiple times daily, leaving the king dehydrated and malnourished just when his body needed all its strength to fight the infection that was destroying his lungs. The constant purging made it impossible for Edward to retain the nutrition that might have helped his immune system combat his illness. Perhaps most horrifically, Edward's physicians began experimenting with exotic remedies that reflected more desperation than medical knowledge. He was fed powdered pearls, dissolved gold, and various animal parts that were believed to possess healing properties. These substances not only failed to help, but often caused additional digestive distress and may have introduced toxins into his already compromised system. Meanwhile, John Dudley was using Edward's weakened state to manipulate the dying king into signing documents that would fundamentally alter English history. The Duke of Northumberland spent hours at Edward's bedside, convincing the confused and pain-racked teenager that changing the succession was necessary to preserve Protestant England from Catholic persecution under Mary Tudor's rule. The political pressure placed on Edward during his final illness was as cruel as any physical torture he endured. While struggling with fever, delirium, and constant pain, he was forced to make decisions about the crown's inheritance that would affect millions of people and potentially trigger civil war. Dudley presented these choices as religious duties rather than political manipulations, exploiting Edward's deep Protestant faith to secure his own family's power. Edward's signature on the documents, excluding his half-sisters from the succession, was reportedly shaky and barely legible, suggesting that he may not have fully understood what he was signing. The king's mental state had been compromised by fever, medication, and the constant stress of his deteriorating physical condition, making him particularly vulnerable to manipulation by adults who claimed to have his best interests at heart. The combination of medical torture disguised as treatment and political manipulation disguised as religious duty made Edward's final weeks a perfect storm of suffering that no 15-year-old should have been forced to endure. King Edward VI's final days in July 1553 were marked by such extreme suffering that even his physicians began to acknowledge privately that their treatments were causing more harm than good, though they continued the brutal medical interventions until the very end. Unable to admit that they were helpless against the disease that was systematically destroying England's boy king, the king's breathing had become so labored and painful that he could barely speak above a whisper, yet he was still required to receive visitors and maintain the pretense of active rule, even as his body shut down. Edward would spend hours propped up in bed, gasping for air while courtiers pretended not to notice his obvious distress. The effort required for each breath was so enormous that simply staying alive had become a full-time struggle that left no energy for anything else. Edward's feet and legs began to swell dramatically in his final week, a sign that his heart was failing under the strain of his respiratory illness and the cumulative damage from months of medical torture. The swelling was so severe that he couldn't wear shoes or stand for more than a few minutes. Yet court protocol still demanded that he appear in public when possible to maintain the illusion of royal health and authority. Perhaps most tragically, Edward seemed to understand that he was dying long before the adults around him were willing to acknowledge this reality. Contemporary accounts describe him asking direct questions about death and the afterlife that made his attendants deeply uncomfortable. The boy king showed remarkable courage and religious faith in his final days, but he was essentially dying alone, surrounded by people who were more concerned with political consequences than with providing comfort to a suffering child. The end came on July 6, 1553, when Edward finally succumbed to what modern medical analysis suggests was likely tuberculosis, complicated by kidney failure and heart problems caused by months of inappropriate treatment. His final words were reportedly a prayer, asking God to save England from Catholic persecution, showing that even in death, he was focused on the religious and political responsibilities that had defined his short life. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed the full extent of the political chaos that his illness had created. John Dudley's attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne lasted only 9 days before Mary Tudor successfully claimed her rightful inheritance, leading to Dudley's execution and Jane's eventual beheading. The succession crisis that Edward's manipulated will was supposed to prevent actually made the transition of power far more violent and unstable. Edward VI's death marked the end of Henry VIII's direct male line and the beginning of a period of religious and political upheaval that would define English history for the next several decades. The irony was bitter. The son who was supposed to ensure Tudor dynastic stability had instead created the conditions for its ultimate destruction. The boy king's death also highlighted the complete helplessness of even absolute power in the face of disease and medical ignorance. All of Henry VIII's wealth, all of Edward's royal privileges, and all of the finest medical care available in 16th century Europe had proven worthless against a disease that might have been treatable with modern antibiotics and supportive care. The next time you think privilege and power can protect you from everything, remember Edward VI, a boy who had everything except the one thing that could have saved him: competent medical care. His death reminds us that no amount of wealth or status can overcome ignorance, and that sometimes the very people trying to help us can be the most dangerous of all. If this tragic story of a pampered prince's agonizing end shocked you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold tales of royal tragedies, and hit that notification bell, because history's most powerful families often hide the darkest secrets. What other royal deaths do you think were covered up or misunderstood? Share your thoughts in the comments below.